we certainly truly did miss. So this is just encouraging for me to be back in front of you all, and I'm excited to get to study God's Word with you. So, like I said, Hebrews chapter 9 is where we'll be picking up there. Shane left off around verse 10. We'll see the plan is, and again, you're not missing out too much if we don't get the slides going there, but the plan is to go through the rest of the chapter. So we'll do Hebrews 9, 11, all the way through 28. But before we get started, let's go ahead and go to our God in a word of prayer and focus our minds this morning. Pray with me, please. Holy God, our King Most High, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing through your Son, we thank you for this time you've afforded to us to study your word together as those intent on learning more about you and your character, the nature of your new and better covenant under which we live, only ratified through the blood of your Son, who died for us so we may be sanctified and purified, and be reconciled back to you, O God, to be restored into that relationship that you always intended for us, that you have sought us out through considering us and have blessed us now with the word we have before us to follow, to consider, and to learn from you, O God, that we may be more equipped and better servants for you, that we may bring glory to your name in all that we do, say, and think, and that through your Son, O God, we can have that hope of being with you in your eternal presence. Help us to be mindful of these things and encourage one another through our comments and our questioning, that we may come to better understanding of who you are and what you'd have us to do. Please be with us now, O God, and we ask all these things through your Son. In his name, amen. So Hebrews chapter 9, we did spend a good deal of time talking about the tabernacle last time. A lot of it with the old tabernacle, yet with reference to, I don't want to say the new tabernacle, but the true tabernacle. And that's really where we're picking back up on. So if you'll head on over to Hebrews chapter 9, there, we'll be picking up in verse 11, but I did want to make reference to a couple other verses before that, because really, we're just continuing the thought of what we started, well, really all the way back in, before like chapter 7, but honestly, where we see the root of a lot of the argument going on here is in chapter 8. So I just want to look at two verses really quickly, and that's Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 1, because as I don't want to say convoluted as the argument might seem, although it certainly does get that way sometimes as we're going through the process here. We're really in the middle of the argument in chapter 9, but he actually lays it out pretty clear for us, because he says in chapter 8 and verse 1, now the main point in what has been said is this: we have such a high priest who has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister in the sanctuary and in the true tabernacle which the Lord pitched, not man. And so that should sound familiar to what we saw last time in chapter 9, verses 1 through 11, because we talked about, well, the tabernacle commanded to Moses to build and construct, which we said is a copy and a shadow, another element we get from chapter 8. But that should sound familiar to us too, because we have such a great high priest, who is Jesus, but he's one who's taken a seat. Well, where's that seat? Well, the right hand of God, which is the true tabernacle, which is in heaven. And so if we have that in our mind, things do line up and make a little bit more sense as we get into chapter 9. But one other verse I wanted to pick up on too, with this kingly priest or priestly king that we have, if you look in verse 6, there's other language there in chapter 8, verse 6 that we're going to see in chapter 9, and then we'll do some reading, and then hopefully you'll see that connection there. So don't forget all this that we've already been studying, but chapter 8, verse 6, but now he, this priestly king whom we serve, Jesus, but now Jesus has obtained a more excellent ministry by as much as he is also the mediator of these things, of a better covenant which has been enacted on better promises. So let's leave it right there. Remember those phrases, because we're going to pick up on that again, because as a Hebrew writer does, he introduces one thing, then goes to something else, and then we're going to come back to it again. So that's where we're at in chapter 9. If you remember those verses, maybe that'll help us sort through this, but let's head on over to Hebrews chapter 9, and we're just going to jump right into our reading, get into some of our observation there, so pick up some of those words and phrases that stand out to you, maybe in connection with what we just read, and then we'll try to make some sense of all this. So Hebrews chapter 9, beginning in verse 11. I know it is a little bit more of a lengthy section, but if I can get someone to read for me all the way to the end of the chapter, to verse 28, that would be fantastic. Well, thank you. And I know this is a longer section there, but it's also hard to pause. The chapter division helps us a little bit, but honestly, as we go into chapter 10, as he's finishing up this argument, we're going to continue to talk about the same things. But we'll pause there because I think that's plenty to discuss. And so I don't want to jump into too much besides you helping me pull out some of the elements that you noticed in terms of phrases, patterns, ideas there, just observationally speaking, that you're noticing, maybe in reference to things we've seen before, but that's kind of permeating this section so we can try to make sense of all this, because there's certainly a lot there. But yeah, what kind of words, phrases are you noticing that are standing out to you? Blood, right? And that's actually something a little newer to us in terms of this argument that we haven't seen before. We've talked about sacrifice to an extent, but blood is repeated multiple times, and we really get into the specifics of that. So I think that's going to be a major theme in this section. What else? The promises, which we saw that word, what we back in chapter 8, right? A better covenant enacted with better promises, and we have that here too. And so we're just picking up on that same argument we've seen before, and we'll talk about what exactly those promises are in a little bit, because the specifics there are going to help us see how this is a better covenant with those better promises. So be looking for that to try to figure out what those promises are specifically. What other words or phrases are standing out though? Blood, promises. Eternal redemption. Well, that's really two phrases that have a whole lot of meaning to them, right? We're seeing any other words related to time, by the way, too, since we're talking about eternal. Once. So like once for all, we're going to see that phrase even in chapter 10. We've seen it already as well, so we're not forgetting that time aspect. But yeah, if we're talking about redemption, we're talking about eternal redemption, and that's where some of those better promises lie. Okay, any other elements there? Mediator. And new covenant too. There's both those pieces there. So, but mediator, we saw that phrase before back in chapter 8, but didn't spend too much time on what that really means. And that'll be a question we'll probably dig into a little bit with our interpretation. But that's what Christ is called here, a mediator. And there's a lot wrapped up in that phrase there. Other elements too, as we're adding to this list of observations. Purified. In fact, there's some other synonyms or like words to purified too. Did you notice that? And it probably depends on your cleansed, purified. The method in which we'll kind of dig into a little bit in a moment. But yeah, that cleansing. Cleansing of flesh. We see that there in verse 13. But we also see in verse 14 cleansing of conscience. So there's the different aspects there that we're making that contrast with. Any other observations, phrases that are standing out to you there before we start digging into these pieces? Okay. Yeah, that contrast, right? We actually do have a lot of talk on animals. Like we went into the detail back in the tabernacle on all the different elements and vessels, but now we're getting into the specifics of under the old law. Specifically what we see a reference there in Exodus 24, animal sacrifice, but the blood of those animals in contrast with what we see with Jesus. And at the same time, you look at that contrast, there's not much of a contrast because of the superiority of Jesus' blood, which we'll look at too. So yeah, that really kind of is that in that section there, in the first half of what we read, and then we'll talk more about Jesus' blood in that second half. But any other final observations there? Oh, so as we go into verses 27 and 28, that's an interesting phrasing there, right? Will appear a second time for salvation, and then in reference to what compared to the first time. And I think we can't forget what's there at the end, what we've been leading up to, because that's the whole point of the argument. And so I want to spend some time on that, especially in reference to our application. But I'll be honest with you. So with all those pieces in mind, blood and talking about cleansing and purifying, the once-for-all nature, as well as Jesus being our mediator, if you read through this section, and I'll just say from my perspective, it's confusing because we're trying to follow the line of argument thinking, and more importantly, at least for me, you're looking at under the old law, under Exodus 24, which is referenced here. How does the sacrificial system even work? I guess that's my question. Like, how does the blood of animals, purify? How does that even work? And that's a question. If that's on your mind, I think that's a fair question, and we'll maybe talk about it a little bit here. But at the same time, I don't want that question to be a barrier for understanding, because at the same moment, that's kind of the point. How does that work? But what truly works? Well, sacrifice of Jesus. So with that in mind, I kind of wanted to go through how we have this broken up here in each section, because if you're looking at this as a block of text, it can get quite in the weeds there. But verse 11 through 14, really, if we look at that, is we're talking about what Jesus' sacrifice does for us. We can't forget who the audience is at play here, both those, who the Hebrew writer is writing to, but also us. Don't lose that thought there, because as we see in verse 14, it comes back to how this interacts with us and how we view our own salvation and what Christ has done for us. If we keep that in mind, then I think we'll be on the right track there. But then as we move into like verses 15 through 22, he kind of explains how that works. How does this even work to the best of our understanding? But also talking about our covenant again. So it's not just a better sacrifice, it's also a better covenant, but they both go hand in hand. And then finally we get into that once-for-all nature. So we're bouncing around a little bit here, but I do want to make sure we answer some questions as we go on through. And so let's start with that first section. As we have in verse 11, Christ appeared as a high priest. We've seen that already over and over again. That's what this whole section's all about. A kingly priest, one who sat down at the right hand of God in a greater and more perfect tabernacle. And one more time, where is that tabernacle? In heaven. What is the tabernacle even on earth? It was representative of God's dwelling place. And now they knew that God, was there, because God is everywhere. But at the same time, it's accommodative. It's a shadow of the true reality. And so Christ is in the true tabernacle. If we have that in mind, then that's going to make sure that the covenant and the sacrifice involved here, it's going to make a whole lot more sense on why it's better. But again, he didn't enter that true tabernacle like the high priest would, right? And going into the holy place, again, which the reality is in heaven, by bringing forth the blood of bulls or goats, but through his own blood. But as we get down to verse 14, and we see that contrast being made, I guess the question is, what is the difference between the blood of Christ and the blood of animals? Again, is it really a comparison? No, but what does this section detail? As you're noticing some different words or phrases being used here, right? What does the Hebrew writer focus on? What is the difference between the two? The power it has. And so, in fact, if you think of what's the result of that as well? And what does the Hebrew writer say is the result of that, the power of that blood? Makes the conscience pure? Rose? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, conscious versus flesh. Now, I mean, did for all intents and purposes, under the old law, the blood of bulls and goats, did it, and the ashes of the heifer, as well as we're talking about all these different kind of cleansing processes, did it cleanse to an extent? Well, the flesh, right? And as you get this picture too, sprinkling blood on everything, that's kind of the opposite picture of something that's clean, at least in my view. Like, everything is getting kind of messy and bloody. But that is a good reminder and symbol, a shadow of what we're going to ultimately see in Christ. Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that choice factor involved in the sacrifice. Because again, this it is a hard thing to wrap our minds around. I'll be honest with you. But as the priest, would take an innocent animal, but it's just an animal at the end of the day, right? As this reminder of the price of sin, right? Don't forget what the real reason is for these sacrifices. It's because sin had taken place. Purification from that sin, at least to an extent, right, had to be taking place here, but it requires blood. And we're going to get down that in the next section, which seems to make a little bit more sense once we realize, okay, why did blood have to take place here? But again, looking at that contrast between Jesus choosing to give himself willfully versus maybe the, more forced nature with this innocent animal. But again, like looking between the two, it seems to be no comparison. But mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. 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 Yes. 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 Yeah, and that's very true, right? As you're thinking of what these animals are meant to do, well, they're meant to kind of substitute in a way. They're meant to be exactly what, honestly, what's a penalty for death? Or what's a penalty for sin? Is death, right? That really would be required. But hey, here's this animal to show us what really should have happened to us. But then here's Jesus. Here's Jesus who, again, as you're looking at what we see in verse 14, without blemish. And to be fair, the animals themselves are described that way. That's what you were supposed to offer to God, something that was without blemish. Yet we're talking about a human being without blemish. And that just completely changes the playing field there. But going back to what the difference is, it's what the result is as well, right? As we were making reference, it's the power in that blood, but it's also what comes from that. And that is cleanse not just the flesh, but cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. Do you remember last time we saw that phrase, dead works? Even Ryder brought it up before. Because that can get confusing. And we just came out of our study of Romans too, and then, what are we talking about there? There's one other time he talked about something very similar here, a couple of chapters ago. Back in chapter 6, verse 1. Which really is why he goes off on this kind of what seems to be a tangent in some ways. He's saying, I want to spend time talking about this, but we got to pause for a moment. Because he says, leaving the elementary principles about the Christ, let us press on to maturity, not laying again a foundation of repentance from dead works and of faith toward God. And then he goes on to talk about everything else in that. But don't get confused here. We're just talking about the dead works of sin. And that's really what's in reference in verse 1 of chapter 6, and same thing here. And that's what we're cleansed from. Cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve a living God. We see the same kind of thing that Peter talks about in regards to baptism, right? It's, what is that? Not a cleansing of the flesh, if you see in 1 Peter chapter 3, but what? Appeal in terms of conscience, a clean conscience to God. And as we continue looking through that, that's a better cleansing. Right, we see that. Better cleansing from a better sacrifice. But we also have a better covenant. And so as we keep on pushing through into this next section in verses 15 through 17, we had that word we brought up. For this reason that his blood is so much more powerful, for this reason that he came for purpose of having cleanse us, our conscience from dead works to serve a living God, he is the mediator. And so let's talk about that phrase real quickly. How does that work? What is a mediator, and what's maybe implied here as we're looking at verses 15 through really 17 there? What's involved in that role? We have talked about that a little bit before, but I want to make sure we have that clear. What's a mediator? Okay. a reconciler, someone who joins back together. In this context, too, what's kind of like the added element, though? What else is involved in someone who mediates? Understand? Okay, yeah, and he certainly does, right? And in terms of he has been through it all. Yes, 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 yes. And so, yeah, with that context, because that's exactly where it goes next, right? Like, let's talk about Moses. Well, that comparison's been brought up before, but is Moses a mediator of sorts? Certainly. But you think, too, how that is one person who is kind of a more, I don't want to say neutral party, because they're involved in it as well, but they're looking at both sides, seeing how he can bring them together. But what makes Jesus different? It's not just pleading on behalf of the people, powerless to whatever God decision is, but he's also the one in which this covenant is founded. And as we see in verse 17, for a covenant is valid only when men are dead, for it is never in full force while the one who made it lives. And so now we have in this role of mediator also the one who accomplishes this reconciliation, not just tries to facilitate it in some kind of distant way. And so that's what's behind all this, because then as we get into this next phrase there, we just read that in verse 17. How does this work? What must happen to the one who makes the covenant? And I'll be honest, this is the verses specifically 16 and 17 are probably some of the hardest verses to translate. So we get all sorts of differences in terms of what your Bible may say in terms of words, because you get words like covenant, maybe used there. You might have a testament or testator, depending on the version you're looking at. Will, yeah, like a living will. And honestly, that phrase is probably what we associate more with this concept. Someone who establishes a will, so after they die, it goes into effect. Now, I'll be fair too. You can't have some living wills that do go into the effect before they die in that sense. But at least the picture we have here is the testator, the one who makes this covenant, must die. But how does all of that work? As we're looking at there, why is there necessity of death? I guess is the question. Talking about what we see in the old law, talking about what we maybe talked about earlier in this section. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when you step back and look at all of that, wills are great. But they anticipate. They anticipate something to happen. But here we have it happening, and that sacrifice he made for us through his death, and that is what makes this a better covenant. Is that it is not just enacted on a better sacrifice, but it's also the sacrifice of the one whom we are engaged in this covenant with, and it's again, lots of layers and elements going in here, but if you step back for a moment and you just see it from that standpoint, the betterness is very apparent. Yeah. Sure. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Mhm. Yes. Yeah, and that's where it gets probably confusing in some ways, but then it also makes the most sense at the same time because this is the true, real reality in terms of the sacrifice. Remember, everything we've been talking about is just a shadow, is just if you want to call it the old, it was pointing to this. It was pointing to this. And so if you take all those elements and wrap it up into a nice, neat package there, that's Jesus, who is the testator, is the sacrifice, and it's through his blood that we're cleansed in that way. Well, that thought continues to progress because we're going into and elaborating on Exodus 24. We see that comparison again with Moses. But as you look at verse 22 specifically, after he brings that example up, and sprinkling the tabernacle, the vessels, all these earthly things. We're reminded of this, and this is the point that he's going to launch off into in verse 23. But in verse 22, he says, one may almost say, according to the law, all things are cleansed with blood, and without shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. And so we already had this idea of cleansing, purifying that, under the old law, that happened according to the flesh, but now under Christ is a cleansing of the conscience to serve the living God. But now here we bring in this idea of forgiveness. And with that in mind, as we're moving into this next section, there's a better forgiveness too. And so as you're looking at verse 23, he's going on as reminding us what we already talked about. All the way back in chapter 8 at the middle of the chapter there, talking about, hey, this is Moses again, talking about the priests who offer gifts according to the law, who serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. Well, we see the same thing here, right? It is necessary for those copies of things in the heavens to be cleansed with these. Verse 23, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. So the reality requires a better sacrifice, and that's Jesus. But as we look at the progression of thought all the way to the end of the chapter, this is where we get these some questions in verse 27 and 28. I don't want to skip over any of those other pieces because we might want to use that to help answer this question. But as we look at verse 27 and 28, now we have this once-for-all nature talked about here. But really, let's try to make some sense of verse 27 and 28 because why is that there? And what does he mean in this phrase with this second time of salvation without reference to sin? So just reading that one more time just to remind ourselves at verse 27, inasmuch as it is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes judgment, so Christ also, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time for salvation, without reference to sin, to those who eagerly await him. Why is this here? I guess it's part of the question. We spent all this time talking about a better sacrifice, the better blood that's offered. We spent all this time talking about how this covenant is better because of what Jesus did in himself being the testator. But now we're talking about judgment and him appearing a second time. How do we place all this in the context? What is the Hebrew writer leading us toward? I don't know that there's one right answer for this one either, but I'm just trying to put this into context here. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Hmm. Hmm. Yes. Yes. Hmm. 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 and and you deal with that with some today who will argue that, and that takes away from that power of what he did. But again, if you look at those two things as, the same purpose in some extents, but different purposes in other extents, he came to deal with sin, and he did. And if anything, that the fact that he's coming again and without reference to sin shows us the power of that sacrifice and how that is a better sacrifice. But with in mind of the future. Because again, Jesus already accomplished that in terms of reference to sin. But who are we talking about here? We're talking about an audience who is struggling, is suffering, is going through doubts, possibly persecution to some extent, or at least societal pressures, even from other fellow Jewish brethren. Yet here is that sacrifice that's already been accomplished, and he's going to come again for those who eagerly await him. But where are they in that phrase? Those who eagerly await him. You know, in fact, this is kind of a nice little bridge going into our applications. I don't want to leave here without that because there's a lot here, and there's a lot of specifics regarding the old law and how the sacrificial system works. But where do we see us in this? How do we? What do we do with this, and how do we start applying it in terms of our own walk in Christ? Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And sometimes those things might not be bad in themselves. Remember, the whole context of this is the earthly versus the heavenly, the shadow versus the true reality. And we live on this earth. We get so focused on the shadows that we don't see the true reality. We're not centering ourselves on Jesus, seeing that He's in everything. And and that impacts everything we do, the way we live, the way we walk, and they might not be bad. I mean, hey, let's be honest. The old law, he's not saying that it was bad, but it was just a shadow. Or we focus on the shadow, we focus on the true reality. That really is the application at its core. Other things lessons we can learn from this, though. Yeah, Yeah. And that's really what this has all been pointing to. Verse 28 really is where it's going toward, is don't forget seeing you in this. But you're right, that they kind of maybe lost out on some of that visual element. I mean, you're right, it's very visceral in terms of all the blood, and we have that talked about here for us. But yeah, to come to Jesus with doubt is to forget why he came to begin with, what we saw all the way back in verse 14, right? How much more will the blood of Christ? Don't forget what you saw in the old law. That was there for a purpose. See, that's what God gave it to them for, is that shadow is for that purpose. But how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works? We don't see that. We certainly do feel that, or we should. Again, that might be a hard difference and distinction to make. But any other points you want to bring up in terms of application as we start wrapping up here? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I do think there's an element there. It can get confusing. But when we know that life is in the blood, God says that from the very beginning, and here comes Jesus offering not just, the penalty of death that we should be receiving, but also offering life. If we get those core principles down, I think we're getting there at least. Yes. Certainly. Yeah. If you take away the penalty, and that goes back to the covenant. If you take away the penalty of sin, well, then what are the blessings? We see that all throughout the old covenant, and then again, when we understand that's new covenant needed to be ratified, there had to be that sense of justice involved. Mhm. Yes. Yes. Mhm. 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 Yeah, and again, at some senses, the contrast, it's almost, it doesn't even seem like it's there because the difference is so huge between what Christ has done and what the shadow, accomplished its purposes in. But yeah, that one man, once for all. And that's actually really where we're going to be heading next. So as we look into chapter 10, we're not done talking about a better sacrifice. So really the eternal nature of it's going to be emphasized even more. So if that still was like, I'm almost there, I'm not quite seeing it, well, I think you're going to see even more clearly in chapter 10. So that's where we'll pick up, Lord willing, on Wednesday. And thank you all for your comments and participation this morning.